Hello YouTube. So I ended up having an unexpectedly medical summer. In June, I ended up being on IV antibiotics because Pseudomonas popped back up in my lungs because Pseudomonas loves me a little too much, it just won't go away. So I did 10 days of home IV antibiotics in June. July I had sinus surgery, which was planned and expected. And I followed sinus surgery with 3 more weeks of IV antibiotics, which was also planned to help me recover, to make sure I didn't get any infections, to help wipe out the infections in my sinuses. That was supposed to be the end of the medical. However, after I finished my 3 weeks of IV antibiotics, a few days after they were done, I started running a low-grade fever. I had a few days of it being kind of like off and on, low-grade fever. Didn't really know why. They sent me for all kinds of testing, including, of course, yet another COVID test. And everything was coming back negative. They weren't really seeing any cause for why I should be running fevers. The fevers then stopped for a few days, so we thought we were in the clear, and then suddenly it came back. And this time it was like a little more serious. Not really serious, but it started off low grade in the morning, and this time instead of being off and on, it just all day slowly climbed. So finally it got to the point that the doctor was like, okay, we need to find out what's wrong with you, come to the ER. So I went to the ER and got even more testing, and this time we finally figured out what was wrong, despite the fact that over the previous couple months I had done a full month of IV antibiotics. I had pneumonia. This is not the first time that I've managed to get pneumonia while on IV antibiotics, but it is the first time I've had pneumonia since transplant. So that was not exciting. The other not exciting thing is that they finally got results back from the previous week and found that, surprise, I still had Pseudomonas in my lungs, which was incredibly frustrating that I had done all this treatment and still had Pseudomonas. Turns out that despite the fact that testing in June showed that my Pseudomonas would be killed by the antibiotic I was taking, when we redid the testing in August, it showed that my Pseudomonas was now resistant to that antibiotic. So I did weeks of IV antibiotics for no reason because my Pseudomonas was resistant. So I ended up hospitalized for the first time since transplant, which was pretty upsetting because before transplant I used to be hospitalized a lot, and I would be in for like a very long time each time I was hospitalized, and that was just kind of my life. But that hasn't been the case since transplant, and it was very exciting to kind of have this new lease on life where I don't live in the hospital anymore. So being back in the hospital for IV antibiotics, particularly for a super resistant Pseudomonas, was really upsetting and also scary because it just kind of made me like flash back to pre-transplant when I was so sick and we kept trying different antibiotics and treatments and stuff for the Pseudomonas, and that nothing was working until I finally got so sick that I had a transplant. So initially I was pretty freaked out about the whole thing. I was like, oh my God, here I go again. Like, I'm like, it's over. It's not, it's not gonna work. But my doctor did reassure me pretty quickly that that's not the case, that it's different now because I do have different lungs, and these lungs are not CF lungs, and that when you have CF lungs, once infections get in, it's almost impossible to get them out. But that these lungs are not like that, and that once we find the right antibiotic, we'll be able to treat it. So he did make me feel better. I also ended up being lucky in that my transplant doctor, who I see at clinic appointments, happened to be on service in the hospital the week that I was admitted. So I had my doctor treating me in the hospital, which was great. What's not great is that they had trouble finding an antibiotic. They basically narrowed it down to, I think it was 5 antibiotics. 2 of them are antibiotics that I have taken before, and they're ototoxic, means that they're toxic to the ears. They can cause hearing problems. I've taken both those antibiotics and they have already caused me permanent hearing problems. So we really didn't want those antibiotics because they could make things much worse than they already are. There was another antibiotic, which is nephrotoxic, which means toxic to the kidneys. And they really didn't want to do that one because I'm on a lot of medication, which it already puts a heavy strain on my kidneys. They don't want to do anything that could possibly push me over the edge into kidney failure. I feel like there was another antibiotic, but I'm not sure. Maybe it was just 4 antibiotics. So the final antibiotic, which is the one that we ended up using, is a new antibiotic. It just came out within less than a year ago. And thankfully, it works for my Pseudomonas, and also it doesn't have strong negative side effects. So those are great things, made it the obvious choice. Problem, possibly because it's such a new antibiotic, they couldn't find any home care companies that were willing to, to offer that as a treatment. And even if they could find a home care company, it's also a really expensive antibiotic, and my insurance would not pay for it at home. In the hospital, insurance just pays like a flat rate per day, and like all your treatment gets covered under that rate. So in the hospital, they could give it to me, but they couldn't give it to me at home, which meant I got to spend the full 2-week course of IV antibiotics in the hospital, which was not fun. And it, of course, took a few days for them to like find and settle on that antibiotic. So I was in the hospital for 2.5 weeks. It was not really how I wanted to spend my summer, on just constant IV antibiotics and eventually in the hospital. So I wasn't thrilled about the whole situation. On the other hand, it was also kind of weirdly nice because I ended up back on my usual hospital unit, which I have not been in since before transplant. So I got to see all my nurses, and with the amount of time I used to spend in the hospital, I knew most of the nurses, in that unit, and they all know me. So it was kind of like a reunion in some ways. And even though I was sick, and the nurses were definitely disappointed that I was sick, and disappointed to see me in the hospital, we were also like happy to see each other, because the last time I was there, I was so sick before transplant and just so miserable, and everything was so terrible that even though I was sick this time, I was so much less sick than I was before transplant that it was super exciting for them to see me, and like see me being able to like walk around and like looking so much better and having gained weight, and just in general things being so much better than they were previously. And it was fun for me to see them. Like, I miss my nurses. When you have a severe chronic illness like this, you really like make relationships with your healthcare providers. And I spent so much time in the hospital before transplant, in the years before transplant. I'd be in the hospital 3 times a year for minimum 2 weeks at a time, sometimes for a month or longer. So I spent a lot of time with these people, and now I don't see them and I don't have any contact with them. So as much as it sucked to be sick, and I really wish that I hadn't gotten sick, it also was nice to have like a little, Silver 11 reunion. So yeah, so that was my summer. Still kind of like recovering from stuff and, making sure everything is back on track and having follow-up appointments. But hopefully things were gonna go better from here on out. And the truth is, as far as transplant complications go, it really hasn't been that bad. A lot of people have a lot worse problems after transplant, and especially in the first, year or two. And so yeah, I've had some problems, but relatively mild as far as transplant complications go. Overall, my transplant is going really well. And the truth is, they tell you before transplant that it's not a cure, and that in fact you're exchanging one chronic disease for another chronic disease. So it's a trade-off. And I knew going in that my life was still going to be very medically involved, there was definitely the part of me that kind of like, you know, had this like hope that it was going to be a magical transplant and everything was going to be fine and I wasn't going to have to deal with major medical problems again. But the realistic part of me knew that that wasn't true. So this was kind of like my first big dose of, yes, you still have a medically complicated life. You're still going to be in the hospital sometimes. You're still going to have problems. And that's just the way it is. And just got to roll with it. And at the same time, recognize that the medical problems that I'm dealing with now are still so much better and so much easier than the ones that I was dealing with before transplant. And that I've still gained so much and that life still has the potential to be so much better, you know, than it was before transplant, even with all the medical problems and the medical complexities. So that's the quick roundup on how my summer went, and hopefully for the next while I will only have good news to share. See you next time.